Welcome to the fifth edition of the Global Engagement Series. We will be spending an hour together today and addressing the economic causes of populism. Indeed, a series of economic crises combined with the ongoing COVID pandemic and the widening social and political divisions have generated significant dissatisfaction with the performance of many national governments across the globe. And this has enabled populists to exploit social and economic divisions to exert influence. Beyond analyzing these causes, we will also discuss the consequences of this populism and hopefully understand what can be some of the solutions. I want to thank our sponsors, Georgetown University Global Economic Challenges Network, Solvay Business School, part of Université Libre de Bruxelles, and the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Special thanks to Professor Frank Vella from Georgetown University and Professor Michael Castanheira. They're from Solvay Brussels School of Economics and Management. They are the force behind these series, behind the conception and the organization, so thank you so much. Today, we're extremely honored to welcome three renowned experts who are joining us to discuss this pressing topic. Professor Danny Roderick from the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us. From the United States, Professor Sergey Guriev, Scientific Director of Sciences Po's Master and Doctoral Degree Program in Economics, and Antonio Spilimbergo, Deputy Director of Research Department at the IMF. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. On the format, each of our panelists will make opening statements of 5 to 7 minutes. Then we will go into Q&A mode. And as a reminder, on Zoom, you can post your questions, and we're very keen to really have an interactive half hour with the audience at the end of the presentations. We're going to start with you, Professor Guriev, to tell us a little bit more about the root causes of populism. I introduced you rapidly saying you're the Scientific Director of Sciences Po's Master and Doctorate Degree Program in Economics. You're also a Research Fellow at CEPR and member of the Executive Committee of the International Economic Association. You were previously for 3 years chief economist at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And some of your most recent research interests include the effects of social media on populism. Finally, for our audience to know, Professor Guriev has over 200 followers on his YouTube channel, which I would encourage you to tune in if you have a moment in the coming days. Professor Guriev, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shehrizada. 200,000 followers, of course, not 200 followers. But
200,000. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Of course.
But this is indeed, I'll talk about social media, how important that is, but this is not what I do for my living. So indeed, I do research on populism, and much of what I know about populism, we put together with my co-author Elias Papayano in a 100-page survey called Political Economy of Populism, forthcoming in the Journal of Economic Literature, and also a shorter version of that can be read on Project Syndicate recently. So I highly recommend reading this survey, which actually is based on 300 books and papers, mostly devoted to the recent rise of populism, mostly in developed countries. And the first question that people ask is this rise of populism real? Is this unprecedented? And the answer to this question is yes. No matter how you measure it, share of populists in government, vote share of populist parties, number of seats in parliaments, however you look, what we observe in the 21st century, especially in the second decade of 21st century, is something we've not observed before. And of course, defining populism is not easy. There is a lot of subjectivity related to that. And still, all researchers agree that the rise of populism is quite unprecedented. If you focus on Europe, this is where it's easier to measure things. The vote share of populist parties in the last 20 years and the last 10 years have risen from something like 10 to 15% of voters to something like 25-30%. So it's a huge increase, which indeed brings a lot of attention to this issue. So what explains it? So since our roundtable is called economic causes, and consequences, let me start with economic factors. And some of those factors are long-term, such as globalization or technological change. These are things which are secular. And of course, you can see salient shocks, such as China joining WTO. But in principle, globalization has been marching on for several decades, and so has the technological change. So the question is, why now? Why do we see a greater increase right now? And so Danny will talk about globalization, and he will probably answer that question. But there are some economic causes which are one-off, which are not slowly changing, which are not long-term trends. And this would be, I would mention, crisis of 2008-2009. I think this is something that people agree on. You mentioned my own research. I have a paper in Brookings Papers of Economic Activities with Jan Algan, Elias Papayan, and Evgenia Passari, where we show that in Europe, it was the shock of the crisis, and we actually make a causal argument. We show the causality goes from shock of the crisis to the lack of trust in national and European politicians and the rise of vote share of populists. And then there are studies now, in particular a study by Tima Fetzer, that show that austerity, which followed the crisis in 2008-2009, the austerity, especially in some European countries, including the United Kingdom, have contributed to the rise of populism as well. Here, I'm actually quite proud that in 2020, we didn't see, well, I'm proud as a member of a profession that hopefully has an impact on politicians. So I think it is a big change in 2020. So we didn't see austerity in response to the recent crisis. And Antonia will talk about COVID and the response of politicians in the West to 2020, 2021 economic crisis. And what I would say here is the good news is we seem to have learned the lessons. Now, what are other explanations of the recent rise of populism? Some people would say it's not about economics, but culture. And culture, things like identity, things like losing status, things like backlash to what's called silent revolution, the rise of postmodernist culture, postmodernist values, political correctness. There is also a question related to why now. This trend has been going on for a while. So why do we have cultural backlash right now? And many people who argue that culture mattered for populism would say that actually there was a trigger from the crisis showing that divides are there. Cultural divides were triggered, were activated by the shock of the crisis of 2008, 2009. There are some papers, and I'm happy to talk about those papers, which show that sometimes you can generate cultural divides without economic shocks. That's also possible, and some populist politicians are really good at it. But most people would actually agree that interaction of culture and economics is probably something that make certain issues more salient and therefore create openings for populists after an economic shock, for populists who focus on identity. I will now not talk about immigration. Hopefully we'll discuss that in Danny's comments or maybe later on. But I'll mention another thing which changed in the last 10 years. So we talk on Zoom now. Some of us connect through mobile devices, and we think that mobile broadband was with us always, but it's actually not true. If you go back to 2007, only 4% of the world's population had access to mobile broadband internet, to 3G or 4G internet. And now Europe is fully covered, and the world, including the developing world, is almost fully covered by mobile broadband, 3G and 4G. And this is just the 10 years of change where the whole world got connected to broadband. A lot of people think about internet being fixed broadband, but actually the vast majority of broadband connections today are mobile broadband connections. And this is exactly where the social media have risen. And there is research, including, as Scheherazade said, my own research, which shows that there is a causal link between the rise of 3G, access to 3G internet, and the lack of confidence in government. And actually for Europe, we also show that the increase in 3G is associated with the increased vote share of populists, and the impact is actually quantitatively large. And so why that works and how that works and to what extent populists can use economic problems to support their narrative on social media. I think I'm out of time now. I'll be happy to talk about it later, but just this is the list of the things I wanted to mention. Long-term trends such as globalization, automation, short-term shock of the crisis 2008, 2009, and follow-up austerity. Things related to culture, identity may be triggered by economic shocks, and the rise of social media and mobile broadband internet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Guriev. A great transition to continue with Professor Roderick, who's with us from Boston, from the Harvard Kennedy School. He has published widely in areas of economic development and international economics. He's famous for his book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? It was quoted by Bloomberg as one of the most important books of the decade. His current research focuses on employment and economic growth, both in developing and advanced economies, and has recently been especially focusing on inequality. Professor Roderick, it's a real pleasure and honor to have you. I will leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahrazad. It's very nice to be in this panel. Very happy to follow Sergey's comments. Sergey mentioned that he's just recently finished a big survey of the literature on the topic, and if there's one person who's read probably everything that's been written on the recent wave of populism, that's probably Sergey, and he did an amazing job summarizing a very, very large literature. I agree with almost everything that Sergey said, but by way of introduction to my comments, which are going to focus, I guess, to start with on globalization and the role of globalization in this, it may be introduced not so much a disagreement, but a bit of a footnote that even though the rise of populism in the present century is something that's new, populism actually has a long history, and in fact, and the reason that relates to my comments is that the very first wave of populism in the late 19th century in the United States also took a form that was very frontally targeting the globalization of the time, which was the gold standard. The People's Party of the United States, which grew out of an alliance of farmers in the southern and western parts of the country, which were being squeezed by the rules of the gold standard. On the one hand, the relative shortage of gold, which drove nominal interest rates high, the global integration of markets that were driving global agricultural prices down. So farmers were being really squeezed, and they really wanted to increase, in today's term, what we would call have expansionary monetary policies to lower interest rate costs and credit costs. And of course, that was not possible by the rules of the gold standard at the time. And in fact, the most famous political speech of the time is the one that was made by William Jennings Bryan in 1896, when he said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," referring explicitly to the gold standard and the suffering of ordinary people, the farmers at the time, because of the rules of the gold standard. So I think that's a very evocative experience that I think that two lessons we should draw from. One is that there has been always this relationship between the ebb and flow of globalization and the kind of a populist or a political backlash to globalization. And it often does take a populist form because it's easy to associate the winners of globalization. In the late 19th century, of course, it was the New York City bankers, the financiers, Northeastern industrialists, and then at the time, the farmers. Today, it's much more perhaps the various small urban centers or the countryside that is left behind, and the winners are the big metropolitan places. And that theme of sort of globalization driving societies apart, clearing as international markets get integrated, you have essentially a kind of a process of domestic economic and social disintegration, and that as a fundamental source of a populist backlash has been a theme throughout history. In that way, I think the populist backlash against globalization perhaps should not have been a surprise, because we already had at least one very good example from US history. Let me say a word on this, sort of question that Sergei referred to as to whether it's economics or whether it's culture. I think we now have a much better understanding of how, in fact, precisely as Sergei said, that economic shocks have been a driver of sort of deepening latent cultural or identity divides in society. And I think that essentially operates through two channels. One is the one that Sergei mentioned, that I think if you lose your job, you're living in a part of the country that's been ravaged by deindustrialization, by trade shocks, and sort of imports coming from other countries. I think there's a sense in which sort of there is that strengthens the latent divisions between in-groups and out-groups. So there's a sense of being threatened, and then you associate those threats with outsider groups, and whether those out-groups might be a racial minority, or it's immigrants, or it's other nations, or a different ethnic group. So that makes it much easier for people to sort of react in that kind of a way. But there is also a second route, which I think is very important, and that's actually how operates on the supply side of politics. That is how political parties, particularly parties of the right, respond to the economic dislocations. And that I think probably has been exemplified best in recent US political history in a book by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson called "Let Them Eat Tweets," and connection to Sergei's discussion of social media, but in a somewhat different way. That the argument in the Hacker-Pearson book is that as economic shocks magnified after the 1980s, partly because of these economic trends that we're talking about, the growing inequality, that the party of the right in the United States, the Republicans, their economic plank becoming more and more distant from the economic concerns of those that were being left behind, explicitly took on a kind of an agenda of deepening what in the United States is a key cultural cleavage, which is sort of racial resentment. So using explicitly the politics of racial resentment as their main way of appealing to voters, given that their economic agenda was largely would not have flown on its merits. Now, there's an interesting question as to why the Democratic Party was, just stood and let that happen. But nonetheless, I think sort of that mechanism of how increasing inequality, increasing economic insecurity also becomes an opportunity for parties of the right to campaign increasingly on identity, on sort of ethno-nationalistic, populistic terms, and that is to some extent, I think, has also happened in Europe. Globalization obviously is not the only shock. I think it's been deindustrialization, it's been technological change, automation, it's been the politics of austerity in Europe in particular. So I think these all have worked in more or less the same way. And I think it's important to underscore that, because the China trade shock or the globalization shock, for the most part, I think is behind us. But that does not mean going forward that the forces that propelled right-wing populism will not reappear, because I think the effects of technological change, labor market polarization, economism, those are still very much with us, and I think they will be a reservoir for populist backlash. So this problem is not going to go away. Finally, let me say that I think at the outset I said there were two lessons to be drawn from the early U.S. political history on populism, and I forgot to mention the second one, but I think it's a nice way to tie my comments. The second one actually is that not all forms of populism are bad. That in effect, the economic plank of late 19th century populism has now become completely conventional economics. After all, what did they want? They wanted a progressive income tax. They wanted to regulate business. They wanted to get rid of the gold standard. Those all have become conventional economic policy. And in fact, in the US, those ideas were subsequently picked up by the progressive movement later in the early 20th century. Ultimately, of course, they became some of the key planks of the New Deal under FDR. So I think that's an important lesson, that we need to be careful about what about populism we don't like. I don't think we like the authoritarianism. We don't like the ethno-nationalism. But many of the ideas in populism which relate to reforming our economic system so that it works better for ordinary people may very well be worth listening to.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. Last but not least, Antonio Spilimbergo will be telling us more about the effects maybe of the recent COVID crisis on populism. As I said, you're the Deputy Director of the Research Department at the IMF. You were previously IMF Mission Chief in several countries from Brazil, Italy, Slovenia, Russia, and Turkey. And you are, amongst other important for us today, also a research fellow at CEPR. Thank you so much, Antonio, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Sherazad. Thank you very much. This was thank you also for the previous speakers for the very nice talk. Populism is a very elusive concept and very controversial. It's one of the most polarizing concepts in political economy. When people talk about populism, they don't feel just cold. They have strong attitude. So when COVID crisis started, there was a sense that this was a moment of reckoning. COVID crisis would show how bad are populists, how ineffective are populists in conducting business, in responding to true crisis. Maybe they are good at criticizing, but when they are in government, they are bad. This was a kind of prior. And there was a kind of, and if you just Google populism and COVID-19, the first title you find are COVID-19 lays bare price of populism. Second, how populism has proven lethal in the pandemic. Third, populism and COVID-19 dating America's next perfect storm. Fourth, populism exposed populist leader like, and so on. So there was a kind of sentiment of Schadenfreude, that the populism would really, at the end, show how bad is populism. Well, if we leave apart this strong sentiment, are there reasons why populists should be bad in dealing with the COVID crisis? What are our priors? One thing which is important to remember, this is the first major crisis where many countries had populist parties in power. So it was a very nice way of checking what our prior or assumptions. What were other assumptions prior how the populists could deal effectively on a crisis? I would say there are 5, 6, 7 reasons why a priori we thought the populists were not good at dealing with crisis. First, populists leave politics as performance. So they have a great attention to communication. But in this crisis, you don't need just communication. You need to act, to do a lot of stuff, take strong and quick decisions. And maybe populists were not good at doing that. Second, populists distrust experts. This is a hallmark of all populists. They really hate experts. And in this crisis, we had to rely on experts. Third, populists are often said to weaken the states. And but in this crisis, you need a strong state and a strong government. Fourth, right-wing populists have nationalistic tendencies. And in this crisis, you needed a cooperative international solution. And so having kind of nationalists in power would be bad for dealing with populists. And finally, populists are prone to conspirational theories. And the last thing you want is to get lost in this kind of theory. So for all these reasons, we thought that populists could not be well equipped to deal with crisis. The overarching reason is also that populists also emphasize this competition between this contrast between the corrupt elite and the willingness of people and the will of people. But at the end of the day, for the pandemic, this is not an important distinction. You don't have to fight the corruption of the elite. So how did the populist regime really were doing during the crisis? Well, if you look at the rhetoric, you saw three kinds of rhetorics around the world of populist regime. In Europe, left-wing populists emphasized that neoliberal policies of previous governments had dismantled public health service, and this would be a big problem to address the crisis. Right-wing populists said that it was something coming from outside, immigrants related. You have a number of cases. We should be more cautious about immigrants in the future because not only they bring economic distress, as Danny was mentioning, but even diseases. And in many emerging markets, you saw another kind of rhetoric, a macho rhetoric. We are strong. We have done a lot of stuff. We don't need to be to take particular measures because we are a strong. We are somewhat strong, naturally protected against external stuff. So you have these three kinds of rhetorics. But at the end of the day, if you look at the data, where populists were damaged or not by COVID, you don't see much evidence. In elections, you have a couple of cases where possibly populist regimes were kicked out of office, but you have other cases where there was not a clear path. Second, on survey of voter intentions, also, there is not a clear tendency, at least in Europe, against populist regime. Third, there is a nice work done by some of my colleagues at the fund, showing that in reality, during the period of distress, you don't see immediately riots or things. This happened later. At the beginning, you have a sentiment of rallying around the flag. And so this is somehow to postpone the day of reckoning to a later stage. So why there is no clear evidence that populists did particularly worse than other regimes? I think that one is objective. The outcomes, as I mentioned, were not worse. I think Kasmud, a political scientist, tried some regression, but has not found a clear evidence that the outcome from the pandemic were worse for populist regime. At the end of the day, is also what matters is the rhetoric, the narrative, and populists, even with all the problems, were able to shape the rhetoric in a way which didn't frame them as particularly bad. And so I think that the statements that populism killed COVID, or vice versa, actually, COVID kill populism is not confirmed by the fact. And what is more interesting for us is to think in the future, what are the effects of how populist regime dealt with the COVID, because this will shape some of the important challenges we'll have to address later on. I'm done, and I keep this question for follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Before we open the floor to a lot of great questions which are being posted, maybe going back to you, Professor Roderick, you talked about good populism, which I thought was fascinating, and actually a contribution of, I guess, what you call pragmatism populism. and how in the past it actually played a beneficial role and governments understood how to manage it. What would you see, what are the ways you would see forward, and what has the past can teach us about ways governments can today integrate some of past lessons, maybe at the Great Depression or at other periods?
Yes, I mean, I think the central, so I think that what's important is to identify what the central economic problem is, and then to devise policies around that. I think for me, the central economic problem of our time, leaving aside climate change, which is undeniable, but I think, I mean, another existential problem in some way, because I think it undermines the cohesiveness of societies and our polities, is this phenomenon of economic dualism or labor market polarization, and both the divisions in terms of what's happening to labor markets, but also, you know, it's regional or spatial expression, which is this divide between parts of regions which are doing poorly and metropolitan centers. These are all linked together, which you might call economic dualism, or you might sort of talk about it as labor market polarization. And for me, that is the central issue. And so if we are going to have the right kind of policies, which I would argue that ex ante will often look like it's some form of populism, because it's undermining established patterns of policymaking, which, oh, by the way, is already happening, right? If you look at, you know, sort of Biden's agenda, you know, we might have thought of Biden as the last person to have brought on sort of a kind of, but he has been pushed by the populist wing of the Democratic Party, whether it's in terms of the fiscal policies, whether it's in terms of their sort of new embrace of industrial policy, whether it's policies with respect to championing labor and their ability of labor to enhance its bargaining power. But fundamentally, none of these things will work unless we're able to address the issue of how we can create better, more productive jobs for the middle of the skill distribution, for the middle class in the United States, in Europe. That is the fundamental problem that labor market polarization throws up. I don't think there is one single answer to that. I've been writing in a number of different places about different approaches. Our welfare state policies are not necessarily targeting this problem very well, because they're targeting mostly the symptoms and the implications, but not the root cause, which is the root cause being this inadequate supply of good productive jobs. And doing that, I think, will require a whole range of policies, from much better training, which is always, of course, the remedy, but also actually some variants of regional industrial policy of working with smaller and medium-sized enterprises and getting them to internalize the problems of not adequate job creation locally. And a major push in terms of our technology innovation policies to try to redirect innovation in a way that's actually much more employment friendly. To prop up wages and productivity in the middle of the distribution, as opposed to, you know, promoting automation and AI and new technologies that are primarily benefiting the top end of the distribution. That's a huge area, but I just want to sort of give you a sense of where I think our policies will need to go.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Very interesting indeed, as Europe and the US are trying to grapple with some of these policy issues. Sergey, maybe a question for you is, what do we know today in terms of lost output and other economic consequences in this whole conundrum of populism?
Thanks, Scheherazade. Yes, there is actually research on lost output, on implications of populism. And the way it works, macroeconomists usually build counterfactual. So they do what's called synthetic growth control panels, and they create a doppelganger for a given economy which is constructed of a weighted average of similar economies. And so I can say, okay, Donald Trump comes to power. I can see what would have happened if US would just continue throughout the trend it was on before. And this research has been done by a number of people. The common co-author to this literature is Moritz Scholarik. The most important paper they've written is the paper which covers all populists in power since 1900 until 2018. And they show that when populists come to power, 15 years later, the GDP is likely to be 10 percentage points lower. So it's almost like 1 percentage point of lost output per year when populists come to power. So when populists come to power, it's bad news. They also look at things like rule of law, media freedom, corruption, and they show that populists more likely than not destroy political checks and balances. When Dani talks about good and bad populism, he occasionally says, bad populists are the ones who destroy political constraints. And these are exactly the majority of populists. And this is why we can think populists destroy economy, because when you have fewer checks and balances, investment climate suffers, and so growth slows down. There are exceptions, of course. So I mentioned Donald Trump. This research before 2020 shows that Donald Trump has had net zero impact on US GDP. So probably he counterbalanced deregulation and trade wars, but they find exactly zero impact on US output. And then on the positive note, I would say whatever we think about Polish government now in power, Polish populists have done in net terms a good job in running the economy. So they outperform the counterfactual. But on average, as I said, populists are costly, and the cost is not trivial at all. In 15 years since populists come to power, your economy is likely to be minus 10 percentage points of GDP lower than under counterfactual.
Thank you so much. One last question from me before we open to the panel. I'm giving you some more time to the audience to also be posting your questions. Antonio, this is a very succession of having a financial crisis and then the sanitary crisis. Very interesting to hear how the IMF is projecting this, and what do you think the long-term policy effects are of having these dual crises succeeding each other?
Thank you for the question. I think that big crises are a moment of rethinking about the role of the state in the economy. And somewhat you have to think about populists as, how to say, populists ask the right question and give the wrong answer. And so I think they have a fundamental role when we need to rethink the role of the state and so in the economy in general. Contrast the Great Depression with the global financial crisis. During the Great Depression, there was a populist movement, Huey Long, in the South, and a lot of the issues which he raised actually became part of the program of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So somewhat the populists at the time were able to influence the mainstream, the platform of the main party. With the global financial crisis, you have a slightly different outcome, because there was a sense that even though the crisis was solved somehow, people were convinced that some instances were not taken on board. And one of the explanations why populists raised in the last decades is the sense of being unearthed. People were not part of this. So a part of the solution somewhat. They didn't understand what the policymakers were doing to save the financial system. I think that looking forward, there are tremendous challenges in the role of the state. There are a lot of issues in the agenda, including climate change, including inequality, including rethinking the health system, that demand a more aggressive role of the state. We do have the fact that with the pandemic, the state had stood up, had increased its role. I think for us is the challenging, whatever we about the future, the role is to be able that these positive energies are channeled in a proper way to solve and to explain back to people why we address the challenges in this way. So so this is just to summarize it. Crisis, health and economic crisis raise issue on the role of the state. Populists are good in interpreting these issues. Our role is to be able to understand and to translate these legitimate concerns in a positive program.
Thank you so much. I'll be taking a little bit of the questions I see here. Matthias de Watripon, who was also one of our panelists in the past, two different questions, two interesting questions from him. One is, how do you, and I don't know who wants to take it, feel about Piketty's point, Professor Piketty's point that in several countries, traditional politicians have abandoned the popular classes, the more traditional right-wing parties are going for the financial and more well-off, and the left wing is trying to serve cultural elites rather than really this middle part of the labor market that Professor Roderick actually pointed out quite well on. So that's one question. Who would like to take that about the role and the abandoning of the popular classes by the traditional parties?
If I can just say something, I mean, to really reinforce that point that Matthias is making. In my comments, I briefly raised the question of why the Democratic Party in the United States stood by idly while Republicans were increasingly becoming the voice of a kind of groups that were being left behind and directing it in a rather dangerous direction, which often, of course, produced Trump. And I think the part of the answer, at least to that, is what Matthias is saying, and what I think Thomas Piketty has highlighted, which is that parties of the left have increasingly become parties of the more educated elite, and therefore have adopted the kind of the worldview, the cognitive maps of the educated elite, which during this period really meant essentially just taking on the kind of Thatcher-Reagan agenda of the 1980s, but simply softening it around the edges, but without fundamentally changing it. And so, the amazing thing during this period is, in fact, how the push for hyper-globalization came from the center left. It was, it was really Clinton in the United States. It was Tony Blair in the UK. It was Gerhard Schröder in Germany. And the push for financial liberalization and free capital flows in the EU came from the French socialists. So it was all sort of the parties of the left, which sort of, and then it was they were left off guard when the populist revolt happened. And I think that's why initially the right-wing populists were in a much better position. I think that might be changing. And again, to some extent, the transformation of the Democratic Party, if it continues, is an indication of that. So I think it may have been a temporary, but I think it is very much that the intellectual narrative that parties of the central left adopted in a way not only prevented them from seeing what was going on, in fact, contributed to poo-pooing the kind of concerns that many people were raising about the consequences of deindustrialization, hyper-globalization, labor markets, and increasing economic insecurity and so forth.
Thank you very much. One question that comes maybe through a lot of the questions here is how to make globalization better, and the two related issues on how to prevent a concentration of the benefits among the very few, the very rich people worldwide, and two, how will actually the future demographic evolutions, including in Asia and specifically China, modify the globalization and this sharing of benefits around the globe? If someone would want to take that. Professor Roderick, you want to
I
that
wanna
again?
monopolize
It's on
that.
globalization and
But I mean, I think very briefly, I would say that, you know, the best way to improve globalization is for countries to actually pursue proper economic and social policies at home. And I think this is where we've gone wrong. And so we've undermined, you know, the danger is that we might, you know, I'm no fan of hyper-globalization, and there's no return to the kind of hyper-globalization we had. But I think the lesson of the 3 or 4 decades after the Second World War is that when we have inclusive economic policies, inclusive economic growth in the major countries, that is very conducive to increased international trade and long-term investment. So the rules of the Bretton Woods era of globalization were extremely permissive in terms of the countries could have restrictions on capital flows, restrictions on trade all over the place. Yet we had very rapid expansion of trade and investment. Why? Because, well, I think, you know, this was a period of economic growth. The benefits were being very widely reaped by broad segments of society. And that is why we got, you know, a lot of globalization. I think what happened after the 1990s is we moved on to a very different understanding where, you know, essentially domestic economies and societies were viewed as the means for globalization rather than the global economy being a means for domestic economic and social prosperity. And I think, so, you know, I don't think we can recreate the policies of the Bretton Woods. That's not what I'm calling. But I think the key is going to be, I think, to producing the kind of adequate economic and social policies that are not simply, you know, transfers and more social welfare and more welfare state. It's actually much more directed at the productive structure of the economy, sort of propping up the skills and the productivity of jobs in the middle of the labor market, which I was talking about before.
thank you
Let me
so
just
much.
add to this.
Sorry.
I fully agree with what Dani has said, but I would also add the issue of corruption of the elites. So part of populist appeal is because people feel that globalization is unfair, and people rise against big corporations evading taxes. And in that sense, what's happening in G7 discussions about corporate taxation is the move in the right direction, not just to pay for education Dani was talking about, but also to restore the feeling of fairness among the people. There was a question on the chat about Brazilian populism, for example, but there are many bad things to say about right-wing Brazilian populists, but the incumbents were corrupt. And part of the campaign was based on fake news campaign against the incumbent Workers' Party in 2018. But part of the campaign was accusing the Workers' Party and the other mainstream party of corruption, which was rampant. And the case of car wash operation was actually there. And another question on the chat was Orkun Sak asked me if social media increase accountability and transparency of the elites. And the answer is, well, social media disseminates bad news better. Maybe it will change. Maybe there'll be more regulation and reform of social media, sure. But until recently, we saw a negative bias on that. And yet, if you're very clean, access to 3G actually improves your popularity. So what we show in our paper, if you take 10 or 13 cleanest countries in the world, the increased access to mobile broadband internet actually increases your popularity, increases support from the voters. So fighting corruption, getting your own house in order, as Dani has said, also creates more confidence in mainstream politicians and therefore in whatever policies they offer, which I think is crucially important, because when you offer structural reforms, like creation of good jobs, you need trust from the public, because the cost of the reforms may come first and the benefits may come later. So without confidence from the voters, you may not be able to solve the problems that populists use to get to power.
Thank you. One question, a couple of also participants, Didier Adler, Roger Lagunov, is about this. Is there a cyclical nature of populism and autocracy? Are we back to the 20s and 30s? There seems to be the same cocktail, quote unquote, as during that period. And why is it so hard to actually break this trend of having populist movements? But more importantly, on the panel, you feel we're in a repeat scenario? Antonio, do you want to?
Yes. I think the best way to think about populism is as politicians, new politicians, giving voice to issues which are not dealt properly, or there is a sentiment they are not dealt properly with the present parties. So in some sense, populism is inherent in any democracy, because in any democracy with a party system, you have that at a certain point parties do not reflect the new views, and so you have to have new actors. Now, the issue is that what are the new issues that now are brought to the fora, to the political arena? I think the challenges are really the role of the state. Maybe up to now, the big issue was the role of globalization, as Danny was arguing. Now I'm proposing that the next set of challenges will be really the role of the state. For almost 4 decades, we were used to think about the state. We didn't think about the role of the state as a, there was a lot of critical thinking about the role of the state, but I think that looking forward, the government has to play a big role. And my guess, and here is my conjecture, is that populists can bring something new to the table and can oblige existing parties to rethink about the role of the government. Also, you see now the response to COVID on the fiscal response to COVID was very different from the response 10 years ago. And this was in part in reaction to populist demands and populist pressure. So I think it's inherent that this appearance of populism somewhat, because it's part of democracy.
Thank you so much. One question maybe from Professor Fernandez from NYU. And this goes back to a discussion about the policy around automation and robotization. Is any one advanced country going to stop the march of automation and robotization? And if not, and if the job of the states goes beyond redistribution, other than saying more training, what would be real concrete economic policies that our heads of states and governments should be thinking about?
Maybe
anyone want to
say again briefly, just to tick off a few things? I think there are sort of essentially 4 different lines of attack on this. One is a kind of on the retraining issue or training issue. I think we now have a much better understanding of what kind of workforce development programs work, and they're typically very different than the kind of training programs where the big money has gone to. The training programs that work best are so-called sectoral training programs, where the training agencies work very closely with employers. So the employer engagement is very important, and these are so-called sort of dual client training programs. That's an avenue where, in fact, you can make training much more useful. Second, with respect to, again, on the line of in terms of working with firms, we also have a lot of evidence on the types of industrial and regional policies that actually work. And again, these differ, the successful ones differ from the kind of tax incentive and open-ended subsidies that typically are used in such programs. Again, they entail very close collaboration with firms and giving them highly customized services and public inputs that are highly localized depending on context. That requires a kind of engagement with firms and a very different type of industrial policy. Third leg, I think, is really trying to work on this question about how can we tilt the direction of technological changes and not simply take the forms of AI and automation we've currently observed as given, as exogenous. We know that there are different AI tools that affect different segments of the labor market differently. And the government and various other agencies have a lot of power to incentivize AI that benefits, that's complementary to the skills of the lower and less skilled workers, that augment those skills rather than augmenting or being complementary to high skills. And finally, I would say you would need a kind of supportive trade and international economic policies, of which, for example, the G7 tax agreement would be an example, where you're ensuring that there are trade and international economic policies that prevent a kind of a race to the bottom. That's the G7 tax agreement as an example, but we can think of other anti-social dumping measures and things like that as well. Again, I'm being trying to observe our time constraint.
Thank you. Yes, we have so many great questions. I can tell you it's very difficult to choose among them. There's one question, maybe I'm going to try to bring a couple of questions here, which is the distrust in media, which we've seen, distrust in science, distrust in, and how do you see that distrust in media, science, hence governments and policy, and the science denial that the populists have pushed? How do you see that, and what do you think has fueled this, and what would be the solution? Anyone, Sergey or?
Yeah, let me say a few words about this. As Antonio correctly said, populists are anti-elite politicians. They don't like elites, and scientists, experts are the elites, especially the technocrats, right? People who are detached from simple people. And so indeed, the gatekeepers, the political intermediaries, the media are the institutions that populists hate. And this is why we always see that populists use the new communications technology. This is something that people underappreciate. Danny mentioned quite correctly the first populist, William Jennings Bryan. He was a great innovator. He would use telegraph, he would use railroads extensively, much more than his Republican opponent. Nazis used radio, right? There was a lot of discussion of Fox News on media, on the Q&A, and of course today we see social media. Why? Because if you want to run a populist campaign using New York Times, good luck with that. You will lose. We don't observe loser populist politicians because they don't make fun. You really need to be innovative and use Twitter to circumvent experts, to circumvent scientists, to circumvent mainstream media and fact checkers. And I think the solution is to respond with the reconnecting with the people like Antonio was talking about. And it's not impossible. We saw Obama ran a great campaign. People underappreciate the digital campaign of Biden. He eventually won. And he did run, he out-campaigned Trump on digital media. And I think we also need to do something about this information and disinformation waves and fact-checking and so on. So there is no time to talk about this, but this is a real danger in there. But yes, populists are the politicians who thrive on distrust in the elites. And every scandal when elites are corrupt, experts are corrupt, scientists are paid by pharmaceutical companies, right? All this stuff undermines the experts and feeds the populists, provides fertile ground. So we should impose more and more ethical rules on ourselves.
Thank you so much. We've got 2 more minutes, and I just want us to end with, in the order of Antonio, Sergey, and Danny. So tough question. You have only one policy that you can apply, only one. Which one would you pick? And Antonio, you're the first one. Only one. No? You're on mute. Sorry.
For the future, yes. I would shape the narrative in a constructive way. I like very much. I was following the G7 statements yesterday. They didn't shape the communication as problem solving. They shape the communication like we do need a new kind of social contract to address new issue for the future. Communication is very important to to have people on board. And this is, it seems, yeah. So communication, proper communication.
Communications. Okay. Sergey.
So
One.
my advice is to listen to our conversation today. So
I
this is
agree.
one big policy. I think Dani has
I
said
agree.
so much. Antonio has so much said so much, with which I agree, and I think that would be the right policy to do. And read what economists have written. And as I said, I think 2020 has shown that politicians have read a lot of stuff or listened to people and did avoid a lot of mistakes. And as we speak, there is an answer to Matthias de Vatripon's question. Can we avoid austerity in 2 years from now? I think we should.
I think we should or we can.
That's a different question, but you asked for advice. Should or should not we introduce austerity right now? President Biden said no austerity, and I said we should not introduce austerity like we did 10 years ago.
Thank you. Fantastic. Then you've got the last word.
Well, this is really an impossible task. But I mean, I think we are in a moment of transition in terms of both economic policy and also in terms of our ideas about what works. And so we need to understand that this is going to be a period of experimentation, policy experimentation, and it should be a period of policy experimentation. So I think we should encourage that, and I think economists should try to not dissuade that experimentation, but they should try to put some reasonable constraints on sort of learning processes. And earlier I mentioned very quickly that there are a lot of things that actually work in terms of policy, but they may be about only 1/100th of our spending. So there is a lot that can be done from sort of learning from experiments that have already taken place, but we also have to engage in more policy experimentation, and we should be open to that.
Thank you so much. Better communication, more listening, and more experimentation. Thank you all. This was an extremely intense hour, extremely rich. Thank you so much. I thank our participants and the amazing questions. And I hope we will have you all, both speakers and participants, at the next event. Thank you so much.